So, Guatemala. When you say the name, you probably think of, well, vibrant markets, maybe? Stunning landscapes, volcanoes.
Yeah, maybe even those incredible Maya pyramids you see rising out of the jungle.
Right. And it's this place, it's got incredibly rich natural resources. It's actually the most populous country in Central America.
Bordered by Mexico, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. Coastline on two oceans. It's quite strategically located.
Yeah, but what's really fascinating here, and these sources we're looking at make this crystal clear, is that all this beauty, this richness, it exists right alongside this deeply complex, often really challenging history.
Absolutely. Marked by, extreme inequality, a long, long history of violence, and quite a bit of external influence as well.
And right at the heart of that story, you have the indigenous Maya people. Their cultural heritage is just so enduring, deep roots in the land.
Exactly.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive. We've got this whole stack of your source materials here, articles, research papers, notes.
Yep, quite a pile.
And we're going to try and unpack it all. Pull out the really important insights, help you understand the key forces, the big events that have shaped Guatemala.
Aiming for those, aha moments without getting totally bogged down in every single detail.
Exactly. We'll be covering a lot of ground, starting way back, ancient times, then the Spanish conquest, colonial rule.
Independence struggles, the Civil War, which was just brutal, and then bringing it right up to the present day.
Yeah. And the sources, they really show this story of incredible resilience, but also this pervasive pattern of violence and exclusion. It's like a thread running through centuries.
It really is.
Okay, let's dive in, starting way, way back. Before Columbus, before Europe even knew this place existed.
Right. So archaeology, based on the studies in these sources, tells us that the first people were here remarkably early. We're talking around 10,000 BC.
10,000 BC, wow.
Yeah. And it's not just that people were here, but there's early evidence of agriculture. Like they found a corn cob near Lake Isabel back in the 90s. That points to pretty sophisticated farming happening way back then.
So deep, deep roots in the land. And of course, this becomes a major center for the Maya civilization.
A huge center. But, and this is something the sources really stress, we shouldn't think of the Maya as just one single monolithic entity.
Okay, that's important. So not like one big empire.
Exactly. It's a crucial insight from the material.
Yeah.
The Maya region, which covered, modern Guatemala and parts of neighboring countries, it wasn't unified. It was more like a complex cultural mosaic, different groups emerging locally.
Right.
We start seeing sedentary villages around 2600 BC, growing maize, beans, the essentials.
And that sort of lays the groundwork for those famous cities we hear about.
Pretty much. So in the pre-classical period, that's roughly 1500 BC up to 8300, you see these proto-city-states starting to emerge.
Okay.
And then the classic period, say 300 to 900 AD, that's often seen as the real high point for Maya civilization in this region.
This is when we get those incredible achievements the sources mention.
Absolutely. I mean, the cities, the monuments, they're stunning. But the sources also highlight their breakthroughs in math, philosophy, astronomy, their complex calendars.
Amazing stuff.
And some of these cities back then had populations that could rival, major cities in Guatemala today. It shows a really highly organized society.
But it's also key to understand things had changed by the time the Spanish showed up in the 1500s. That peak was already in the past.
Yeah, that's a really important point from the sources. A major decline started back in the 10th century, especially in the central areas.
So places like Tikal.
Tikal, Palenque, Yaxchilan,
Yep.
a lot of those great centers were already deserted or mostly abandoned, centuries before 1500.
Huh. So what was the situation like when the Spanish arrived?
Politically, things were fragmented. The Maya were split into various competing states, and they spoke different languages too. Quiches, Ixil, Ojibal, Quechua, Mam.
And that fragmentation probably played a role later during the conquest.
Definitely. It made a unified resistance much harder.
The sources also mention some other important cities from before the conquest, besides the really famous classic ones.
They do. Kaminal-Juyu gets mentioned an ancient, really significant site, sometimes called a mother city. It grew quite large, even had ties with Monte Alban way over in Mexico around 8400.
Interesting.
And then there's Kumarkash, described as this impressive citadel built by a lake for protection. It was apparently the largest, most imposing city of the Guatemalan Maya right before the Spanish arrived, built for defense.
Which brings us right to that huge turning point, the Spanish conquest.
Yeah. The whole European expansion thing starts with Columbus, obviously. He actually touched the coast near Guatemala on his fourth voyage, 1502.
Right.
But the real invasion of this area kicks off a couple of decades later.
And the main guy here is Pedro de Alvarado.
That's him. Hernan Cortez, fresh off conquering the Aztecs, sends Captain Alvarado south. He gets here in 1524.
With Spanish soldiers.
Spanish forces, yes, but also, crucially, a large number of indigenous allies from Mexico. That was a key part of the Spanish strategy everywhere.
Okay.
And it's worth noting, the native accounts that are cited in these sources, they paint Alvarado as just exceptionally savage, brutal.
Sounds like the conquest was violent from the get-go.
Extremely. The sources detail really fierce resistance, especially from the Quiche people, who were powerful, brutal battles.
Any specific examples?
Well, there's one near Tsupsup where a major temple was burned down. Alvarado himself got badly injured in one fight, though he recovered and just kept going.
Wow.
There's even a legend mentioned about a huge crack opening up in a valley, supposedly when a major Quiche chief died in battle. Of course, the Spanish had the technological edge guns, horses.
Things the indigenous fighters just didn't have.
Exactly.
Then the immediate impact on the Maya population sounds devastating.
It was horrific. Massacres, extreme brutality by Alvarado. The sources document it well. Torture, killing of nobles, priests, ordinary people, systematic destruction of temples, religious sites.
Just complete upheaval.
And the death toll.
Yeah.
In those first few decades after the Spanish arrived. It was just staggering. Some sources estimate maybe 750,000 people died.
750,000.
It's a combination.
Yeah.
Direct violence, obviously,
Yeah.
but also introduced diseases like plague, smallpox. The native populations had zero immunity, and just the general chaos and disruption of the conquest.
So that pattern of violence, of disruption, it's set right from the very beginning.
Absolutely.
And the Spanish, they also had to figure out where to actually set up their capital, right?
They did. Their first try was a place called Santiago de los Caballeros de Guatemala, near where Antigua is today.
Okay.
But the sources say it got completely wiped out in 1541. Massive mudslide, flood after a volcanic eruption just obliterated.
Oh, wow.
So they built a new town nearby, El Antigua. That one lasted over 2 centuries at the capital. But then major earthquakes in the mid-18th century forced another move to where Guatemala City is now.
Constant struggle with the landscape, too.
Very much so.
And here's where the sources make this really chilling connection, linking this early period to much, much later.
Yeah, this is striking. What the sources point out is how the strategies the Spanish used back in the 1500s, the ways they controlled the indigenous people, the territory, basically methods of pacification. These served as direct inspiration, like a playbook, for the Guatemalan military's tactics against Maya communities in the highlands, like the Ixtal Triangle during the Civil War in the 1980s.
That's horrifying. The same strategies centuries later.
It suggests this underlying approach to controlling indigenous populations just persisted, a terrifying echo across time.
That is profound and disturbing. So, okay, moving into the main colonial period, how did the Spanish really cement their rule? What did life look like then?
Well, they took political control, obviously. They founded more towns, often placing them strategically in the highlands, like that second Santiago de los Caballeros in 1540.
The highlands.
Better climate for the Spanish, often, but also close to the large indigenous populations and resources they wanted to control. These towns became nodes of power.
Right.
They set up this whole bureaucratic and economic administration, often worked very closely with the Catholic Church, subjecting the existing indigenous towns to Spanish authority.
And the economy, that must have changed completely.
Really transformed. The focus shifted away from just extracting resources to large-scale commodity production. Sugar at first, but then later, and this is key for Guatemala, coffee, especially in the wet coastal lowlands.
And who worked these plantations?
It relied heavily on forced labor from the indigenous population, various forms of slavery, serfdom.
So exploitation built right into the system.
Absolutely. And the sources mention that sometimes parts of the old Mayan nobility actually collaborated with the Spanish. They kept some authority, but within the Spanish system, and often helped manage the forced labor.
Complicated. And this also set up future economic ties, right? Like with the U.S.
Exactly. Fast forward a bit. By the 1900s, you start seeing significant trade with the U.S., basic crops. But more importantly, major U.S. investment starts pouring in.
Into what?
Oil, railroads, and huge amounts of land, especially for fruit cultivation. This really started integrating Guatemala's economy with U.S. capital.
A pattern that continues today, in a way.
Yeah, though now things like remittances money sent home by Guatemalans working abroad, are a huge part of the economy, too.
Okay, so skipping ahead again to the 19th century, the push for independence from Spain.
Right. Guatemala declares independence in 1821. There's a brief period where it's annexed by Mexico, then it joins the United Provinces of Central America.
But that didn't last long.
No, that federation breaks apart by 1840. Guatemala becomes its own republic.
But did independence actually mean, freedom and equality for most people?
So that's where the sources are quite critical. They argue that power basically just transferred from the Spanish-born officials to the local elite, the criollos, people of Spanish descent born in the Americas.
And their main interest?
Protecting their own economic privileges, especially land and labor control. So this led to pretty fierce repression, suppression of civil liberties, anything that threatened their position.
So not exactly a new dawn for everyone.
Far from it. The period from about 1830 to 1930 is described as just constant political turmoil, exile, violence. It really highlights the instability and the brutality of elite rule.
And the economic gap between rich and poor just got wider.
Precisely. They did write a constitution in 1844, the first in Central America, setting up government branches. But political unrest, dictatorships, that continued. And the sources emphasize this. Only the wealthy landowners really paid taxes. Meanwhile, land expropriation, taking land from indigenous communities and poor farmers, increased massively.
So embedding that inequality even deeper.
Exactly. Setting the stage for conflicts down the road.
Were there key figures driving this in the 19th century?
Yeah, the sources mention President Rafael Carrera. He was a dictator, basically, from 1844 to 1860. And he actively reinforced that social hierarchy, the gap between the elite and the landless. Okay, later on, you have just a Rufino Barrios. He really pushed for opening up the country to foreign investment, building railroads, that kind of infrastructure.
And how do the sources interpret that?
The analysis is pretty clear. These foreign companies, exploiting the land, often worked hand in glove with the ruling elite. And this setup basically helped keep the countryside under control, quiet, by maintaining elite power over land and labor.
Which brings us right into the really turbulent 20th century. Those inequalities must have been simmering. What was the situation early on?
Yeah, the early 20th century is dominated by just a handful of wealthy Guatemalan families and, crucially, the American-owned United Fruit Company.
UFCO? They come up a lot.
They loom large. The sources are really clear. United Fruit wasn't just some company. They controlled vast amounts of land, ports, railroads. They had immense economic power and huge political influence. Basically shaped government policy to suit their interests.
But there was a moment, wasn't there, an attempt at change?
Yes. 1944, the fall of the dictator general Jorge Ubico. He'd been there a long time. It happened after mostly bloodless popular protests. They call it the October Revolution.
And that opened a door.
It did. A window for a more democratic government under Juan José Arevalo. His government brought in reforms, things like public education, recognizing labor unions, trying to address some of those deep inequalities.
And then came Jacobo Arbenz.
Right. Arbenz gets elected in 1950. He continues down this reform path. And his big thing, highlighted in the sources, is agrarian reform, land reform.
What did that involve?
It aimed to take large, unused land holdings, much of which belonged to United Fruit, and redistribute it to landless peasants.
Okay, that sounds like a direct challenge to United Fruit.
It absolutely was, a direct challenge to entrenched foreign economic power.
And this is where the U.S. government gets involved in a big way.
Hugely pivotal moment. The sources really go into the 1954 CIA-backed coup that overthrew Arbenz. It's presented as like one of the first, clearest examples of overt U.S. intervention during the Cold War.
Why did they do it?
The newly formed National Security Council in the U.S. saw Arbenz's reforms, particularly the land reform, as potentially opening the door to communism, a threat to U.S. security interests, even if the intelligence didn't fully back up those fears. United Fruit lobbied hard, too, of course.
What happened after the coup? What were the consequences?
Devastating. For Guatemala's democracy, anyway. Castillo Armas was installed as dictator. He immediately rolled back rights, banned leftist groups, and crucially, reversed most of the land reforms and social programs.
Did it bring the stability the U.S. wanted?
Not really. The sources clearly state that instead of stability and growth by the end of the 1950s, it led to more violence, more political instability, cycles of repression. Assassinations of political figures just became depressingly common.
And this is the direct lead-in to the decades of civil war.
Yes. When you shut down democratic channels for change and use brutal repression, organized opposition eventually emerges. Guerrilla groups started forming. The revolutionary movement gained a lot of traction in the highlands, especially among indigenous communities who'd faced centuries of marginalization.
And the government's response?
All-out war. Systematic, brutal. The sources detailed just horrific increases in murders, rapes, torture. They even mention new, terrifying methods like death flights, throwing people out of planes to make them disappear.
Just awful. And it sounds like the indigenous population bore the brunt of this, not just caught in the middle.
That's a really critical point the sources make. The government's counterinsurgency strategy specifically targeted indigenous communities in the highlands areas, like Baja Verapaz, El Quiche, Chimaltenango.
Why them specifically?
The military government saw them as the heartland of the revolution, the support base for the guerrillas. So the sources say the government adopted a zero-tolerance policy towards them.
Zero tolerance? What did that mean in practice?
It essentially translated into a strategy of ethnic cleansing.
Yeah.
Massacres, scorched earth tactics. It was horrific. The stats are stark. Over 85% of the documented human rights violations during the war were committed by state security forces.
85%? That just underscores the scale of state terror. And the total death toll.
Immense. The war lasted from 1960 right up to 1996. And over that time, 200,000 Guatemalan citizens died.
200,000, just catastrophic.
A period of unbelievable national trauma and destruction.
Did the sources elaborate more on the U.S. role during this long war period beyond the '54 coup?
Yes, they do. They mention detailed plans drawn up by U.S. counterinsurgency experts, desk job plans, maybe not always with direct White House sign-off, the sources say.
But still developed within the U.S. system.
Right, developed because they were seen as necessary for American security interests. Shockingly, some plans apparently even included preemptive killings.
Wow.
And U.S. complicity didn't stop in '54. There was funding for anti-government rebels initially, though that changed over time, attempts to control information. And later, the sources mentioned DEA and CIA involvement alongside the Guatemalan army in operations against the insurgents.
So a long and complex involvement. After all those decades of horror, how did the war finally end?
Well, the really intense phase started winding down after the dictator General Efrain Ríos Montt was overthrown in 1983. That opened the door for peace talks, which started tentatively in '84.
And led to the peace accords.
Eventually, yes. After years of negotiation, the final peace accords were signed in 1996.
How significant were those accords? Did they really change things fundamentally?
They were hugely significant. They formally ended the war, which was massive. And critically, they led to a new constitution in 1997.
What was special about that?
For the first time, officially, it recognized Guatemala as multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, a huge symbolic step after centuries of trying to erase or ignore indigenous identity.
So recognition on paper, what else did the accords cover?
Key agreements on things like investigating past human rights violations, truth commissions, and starting to resettle the huge numbers of people displaced by the war. The UN had a big verification mission, MINGUA, overseeing it all.
Were there real efforts to rebuild, to address those historical wounds after '96?
There were efforts, yeah. Between '96 and about 2001, focusing on things like education, health, housing, land access, credit for communities hit hard by the war.
Did they help?
The sources say they did provide some relief, alleviated some immediate suffering from decades of abuse. But, this is a big but, they're also described as being left highly unfinished.
Meaning?
Meaning they didn't really dismantle the deep structures of inequality. They patched things up but didn't fix the foundations.
And it sounds like the war's legacy and the aftermath wasn't felt the same way by everyone.
Definitely not. The sources highlight a stark difference between the experiences of the Mestizo or Ladino majority and the indigenous peoples.
How so?
It shows up in ongoing severe poverty and marginalization, especially in indigenous areas. One source even mentions the term indigenization of poverty being used by the state itself.
Wow, like poverty becoming concentrated among indigenous groups.
Exactly. As a direct result of history, the war, and the failure to fully implement reforms.
So bringing us to today, what does contemporary Guatemala look like, wrestling with all this history, according to these sources?
It's painted as this land of contrasts, really. Huge potential, incredible beauty, creative people.
Odd.
But its social fabric is described as rent, torn apart by extreme socioeconomic inequality, and this volatile politics of exclusion. Those historical patterns are still very much alive.
What are the biggest challenges right now?
The sources list quite a few. Deep problems with socioeconomic development, high levels of violence that need preventing, reforming the civil service, chronic malnutrition, especially in children, food insecurity.
Big fundamental issues.
Huge.
Yeah.
And the analysis is that the responses often fall back on these sort of binary solutions and quick fixes.
Like treating symptoms, not causes.
Exactly. And critically, failing to really grapple with the deep legacies of trauma, those historical patterns of exclusion, the rupture caused by the war.
And economically, is it still precarious like in earlier periods?
Very much so. The economy is described as disorganized, resources, businesses, still largely controlled by foreign interests or just a tiny handful of companies.
Really?
Yeah, one source states that just 5 corporations control something like 80% of agriculture and mining today.
Wow. And wages?
Incredibly low, often cited around $1.50 to $2 a day. You just can't live on that.
Which leads to massive poverty, I assume.
Absolutely. Estimates cited are around 80% of the population living in poverty and maybe 60% in extreme poverty.
60%. That's staggering.
And, mirroring history, it disproportionately hits the indigenous population, who make up about 60% of the country, but bear the brunt of poverty and the war's legacy.
Education sounds like another huge barrier, too.
It is. A fundamental one. The average schooling across the country is tragically low, maybe 2 or 3 years.
Only 2 or 3 years?
Yeah. Overall illiteracy is around 40%. But among the indigenous population, the sources cite figures as high as 80% illiteracy.
80%. That's, again, a direct consequence of history.
Direct consequence of historical neglect, marginalization, lack of investment.
So it really feels like all these current problems aren't new. They're deeply, deeply rooted in the history we've been talking about.
That's the overwhelming takeaway from these sources, yes. They explicitly connect today's challenges, the poverty, inequality, instability, lack of development, straight back to the inequities that started with colonization and were just made worse by centuries of conflict, elite control, foreign intervention, and critically, just not enough sustained fundamental effort to fix the problems, even after the peace accords.
Amidst all this difficulty, though, it's important we don't forget Guatemala's incredibly rich culture, which the sources also touch on.
Absolutely. It is a land of tremendous cultural diversity, described as a cultural mosaic, 33 recognized ethnic groups mentioned in one source.
And the Maya influence is still strong.
Very strong. It's not just history in a book. It's a living heritage. Today's Maya people are the direct descendants of those ancient civilizations. And they're actively asserting their identity, their rights, their right to exist as Maya, despite everything.
That resilience is amazing.
It really is. Sites like Camanaljuyu, they're not just ruins. They're part of this ongoing cultural identity.
What about the environment? How has that fared through all this?
Well, the region that supported those dense Maya populations and cities, it was heavily forested back then, part of the really vital Mesoamerican biological corridor.
But not anymore.
Since the Spanish conquest, there's been a dramatic loss of forest cover, a huge decline.
Driven by agriculture again, export crops.
Exactly. Cattle ranching, expanding sugarcane, coffee, rubber plantations, those were major drivers historically. And it really accelerated with multinational corporations in the 20th and 21st centuries.
How much forest has been lost?
The sources estimate about 2.3 million hectares just since 1960. A lot of that linked to large-scale logging, often by foreign companies.
And this degradation, it has knock-on effects today.
Big time. Increased desertification, more forest fires. They've apparently tripled in the last decade, which turns damp forests dry. Diverse areas become monocultures. And this isn't just an ecological issue. It hits people hard. More urban flooding, impacts on wildlife. It even contributes to migration. Some sources actually use the term environmental refugees.
People forced to move because their land is ruined.
Or because of insecurity linked to scarce resources and conflict over them. It's all interconnected.
Have there been any attempts to protect the environment over the years?
There have been efforts. Some legislation back in the 19th century. A National Forest Institute was set up in the 1940s, the first protected area in 42. So some recognition. But the sources note persistent challenges, like unsustainable logging, just continuing lack of enforcement.
And the impact on biodiversity, animals, plants?
Sadly, significant losses. The sources list specific species now extinct, like von Berlips's hawk owl, the Espanten goose. Others possibly gone, like the gopher tortoise, often due to poaching, habitat loss.
Lakes, too.
Yeah, important lakes like Izabal and Zolatan are mentioned as threatened. Fish stocks declining because of pollution, human activity, climate change impacts.
Okay, so looking back at this whole sweep of history, from the ancient Maya to today, pulled from all these sources, what's the single thread that runs through it all?
I mean, as the sources really lay it out, it's undeniably this pervasive pattern, a cycle almost of violence, deep inequality, and exclusion.
Starting with the conquest?
Starting with the conquest, the brutal labor system, reinforced by the elite after independence, intensified massively during the Civil War, especially against indigenous people. And it just continues to shape the country's struggles today.
It creates such a stark paradox, doesn't it? This country with so much potential resources, culture, people.
Incredible potential, yeah, but constantly held back, crippled by these deeply embedded historical legacies and the ongoing challenges they create.
And the sources really hammer home that this isn't just past history. It's living history, creating unresolved traumas, power dynamics that directly affect the present.
Right. You can trace today's problems, the poverty, the marginalization, the fragility, the environmental issues. You can trace them right back through centuries of these unequal structures and, frankly, not enough effort to fix the root causes.
So based on everything we've dug into here, especially that persistent inequality, the indigenous struggle for rights, how history keeps echoing, here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on.
How do those unresolved traumas, those historical patterns of power and exclusion we've seen laid bare in these sources, how do they continue to haunt and really shape the actual possibilities for peace and justice in Guatemala today?
Understanding this layered, often painful history feels absolutely crucial, doesn't it? For making any sense of Guatemala's present or thinking about its future.